Industry to know. By the way, maybe I should be careful when they start becoming sentient. When our computer overlords take over, think about it. We still got another good 6 months, I think. What is economics? The dealing with scarce items in what ways? Production, consumption. Yeah, someone has it, wealth goes, and how do you do that equitably? And by the way, these are laws. Economics, I know it sounds like it's something abstract or almost like it's natural, just like the howler monkeys out in the trees out there. But we're back. You've been looking. Has you ever seen a howler monkey? Yeah, they're used to be all over howler monkeys. So I was walking by a tree that had howler monkeys. It was in Miles City. It was in Costa Rica. But I looked up and I saw this motion. I thought, what the heck is that? And I looked up and saw this black, muscular black thing up there. My first instinct was, it's still stuck with me. Why is there a black lab up in that tree? And I couldn't escape that then, but the rest of the time the monkey's looking at me. You're not a black lab. By the way, they throw things at you. Huh? Near me.
What did they throw?
Think about it.
Oh, I think you should tell us what they threw.
It's something that, yeah. Moving on. And I guess I don't necessarily blame the monkey for doing it, but, and I'm glad I wasn't, well, you know, but. Okay, just check. And so, how to deal with scarce resources, and what is capital again? The means of production. So capitalism is what kind of economy? Say it again? A market economy, but it's different. Unlike with people doing all the production with your hands, what do you have? Who owns the machines? The merchant capitalist, or just the capitalist, just means the person owns the machines. And then who, the vast majority of everybody else, what? Yeah. And they have now more and more, labor has to go to where the machines are. And that's a big shift. And I'm trying to think of anything else. Who is the man who did a lot for public education? You remember him for the idea of who? Mann. I knew you got the H in your head. Yeah, Horace Mann. And and it's going to be, are we going to have citizens or workers? And that's a thing that's debated all the time. And before 1815, families were what? Where did they get their stuff? Yeah, self-sufficient. They were producers. And they did it with their hands. And what do they call that system where merchants would put it, okay, I just told you. The putting out system. What's the other name I gave you for it? Yeah, cottage industry. It's a term they use today, meaning they would produce at homes, very decentralized, but that's what they call the putting out there. And yeah, that's a big shift. And who was their boss? Yeah, they were basically their boss. They had a level of independence. Don't get me wrong, it was a hard, back-breaking job, and who lost power? Could be anybody. Did we get right here yesterday? We were about right here, correct? Yeah. So women lost power, and this, without a doubt, they became more dependent upon men. Men gained power. And did we get all the way to here? Yeah. And women did resist this. And how do you keep them from resisting? By the way, they're going to set up this sphere for women. Women have a role to do good, whatever that might be. That's a loaded statement in many ways. But this became the idealized role for women. So here we have, who's in charge here? Who's standing, looming over everybody? And then they're all looking just with admiration towards him. But it's clearly this family, and it's almost like he came from another world and entered it from this wild and crazy world of industry and finance and work to this different world at home. Now, life was not like that for virtually everybody before. Everybody had to work. And let's be clear about it, too. Keeping care of children is work. But it's different now. it's not valued as much because of that whole concept of the wage system, which is kind of ridiculous. But then again, remember, why did families have children for the most part before the Industrial Revolution? Good little workers. I'm exaggerating a little, but not much. You needed big families because you needed workers. And the cat's going to eat them all someday. But what's the name for this? The cult of domesticity. And it's going to be cult because it was almost like they push it like this religious idea. They also call it the cult of true womanhood. And it pushed this idea of middle-class values, where this new society where the husband can go off and make enough money with a wage to feed the whole family. And women stay home. In fact, they talk a lot about the women's sphere. This is home, and the outside world, that's for men. So the empirical world of capitalism and finance and invention and work and higher education, government, that's for men. And women, their role is to keep a nice house for her husband and teach the morality and the values to the urchins, to the children. That's their role. So it was argued that don't resist this. And it wasn't like all of a sudden you remember like, oh, we got to fight. It was more like this just general feeling of unease and insecurity because all of a sudden you just feel the value has shifted away from women. And so they'll teach the morality and values of children. See, the sphere of women. So she's raising them, teaching them to read. I don't know what that is, but there's even toys. Toys for children. That's kind of a new thing too. But, so what's the role of woman? Her number one responsibility, in fact, if a woman then in this new world wants to be a success in this engineered world they're creating for women, their number one job they have to do is get married. And if women aren't married, they are a complete and total what? Failure. That is the only avenue for success in this cult for domesticity. But the idea was, this is the way women have always been. You want this. Now, of course, there's nothing wrong with being married, but the point is that is the only avenue for success is to have a marriage, to be married, keep care of your husband. Nobody cared if you had a clean house until all of a sudden this hit. So women have a job of keeping a clean house and then have children and care for them. That is the role for women. And if women do not do that, they are failures. And that is the only avenue for success for women. And so it didn't take long for this idea that women who want to do anything else were considered to be abnormal, weird, there's something wrong with them. And therefore something wrong with their parents, and you can go on and on. But that is the only avenue for success. Now, it wasn't overnight that people thought this, but it became engraved, it became taught, just as it was taught to men, that they should expect to give up certain freedoms to go work in a factory for a wage. Here, this is what women are expected to do. By the way, who taught young girls to be like this? Who? Their mom. Because that's what she was taught. And also this kind of responsible, I have no choice. This is the world, I must teach it. Even if their mom might be, I don't particularly like it, but there must be something wrong with me for not liking it. And you see big elements of this in the right after World War II, when a lot of women entered the workforce. And then there was almost this desperate desire to get back to normal. And women gave up those jobs and went to go back to be housewives in the affluence of the 1950s. And there's a general feeling of unease, which will come about in the 1960s. That's another area we'll get to history in April. Sound good? All these things relate. But this role for women, this is relatively new. And this is all from the Industrial Revolution. This is the Industrial Revolution. It was kind of a vague connection to the way that very upper class women lived, but that's totally different than the way most people live. And here's the thing. For most families, did they live like this? No, they barely made enough to survive. So it's always like, well, this is the way it's supposed to be. And someday we can be like this. And so women would resist this, but it was seen as abnormal. And think about how this has survived today. If you ever watch television or see commercials, and they have commercials for household appliances or those kind of things, or doing things with the children, who it's basically doing mostly. And it's women. And if men do it, it's almost like a joke. Huh, man, this is not your sphere, man. You're out of place. This is for women. And this goes back to the cult of domesticity. It's a really big shift. And it's kind of amazing how fast it hit. And also, what does this do for men? Doesn't this give them more power? Doesn't this? Yeah, it does. So, another concept that came out of this, and it's related and one I must introduce, but it fits very much, is Republican womanhood. And this idea that not only are you going to teach them to be moral and upright citizens, or moral and upright people in a society, but also as good citizens in a republic. So this concept has, and this kind of cheesy cartoon shows it. I'll go take care of the important stuff like business and politics, while the mother stays home and raises the children. This is a big, big, big shift in society. And so it's amazing when people talk about it to this day and talk about the traditional roles of men and women. I know the traditional roles for men and women in most human history was to work very hard to survive. And then it became this in the 1800s. This will become a big issue as a backlash against the women's rights movement in the 1970s. That women should accept this traditional role, which was very, very new. And it's no coincidence. If women lost power, legal rights began to go away, political rights, kind of assumed rights would disappear, and women would have to fight very hard. And also, one more thing. What about these things? Yes?
It's like in school, or was the school like more
Well, we've already talked a little bit about public education starting. It's no coincidence that public education also took off at the same time as it's called domesticity. Because if women are responsible for the moral and ethical upbringing of their children, then it would be this push by women to say, our children deserve education. And so you see a trend coming at the same time. A desire for education for lots of reasons, including good workers and citizenship, along with families demanding schools to keep up with this changing world. And speaking of that, what's going to happen to the size of families once the Industrial Revolution begins? They're going to start shrinking dramatically. Why? Children are expensive. They eat. They demand crazy things like shelter and clothing. I know, isn't it just unbelievable? Before the Industrial Revolution, for virtually all families, children were economic entities too. They worked. They provided for the family. After the Industrial Revolution, for more and more families, children don't do that. What do children do? Some families, they're still workers, and don't get me wrong, but the trend is going away from that. But where does a family now, when they enter the Industrial Revolution and that husband gets a job, where's their money come from? All their money. One paycheck. Kids are really expensive. So now you're going to have this concept of, we got to plan when we have children. We got to be careful. Because we might not be able to afford 20 kids. I'm not saying they still didn't do it, but families actually started to get married younger with the Industrial Revolution and have smaller families. You see the same thing with everything from nomadic groups. They couldn't have large families, so they tried to regulate that. Same thing with here, smaller families because children are expensive. And here's the thing though, children go from being kind of an economic necessity to what? Are they a necessity for the survival of the family? Oh, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying the children aren't important. But now it becomes more of a choice for who will have children and how many will have. Does that make sense? So, shouldn't we care for them? Shouldn't we even know their name? Before, they're good little workers. Now, we're going to have them Because we want to have them. We think it's a good thing to do it. We want children, so we have kids. Therefore, we're going to be responsible for their moral and physical upbringing. We're going to try to raise them as good people, hopefully. It's hard to do, but the whole idea of children is going to change. We're going to treat them better. We're going to try to do nice things for them. We're going to have toys for them. Thank goodness there's an industrial revolution to make stuff. The whole attitude about raising children will change. They're going to go from being workers to more and more, if you can afford it, to have this kind of isolated little world that they only go to school and home and you can care for them. All of this is a trend of the 19th century. Gee, if you're going to be nice to children, maybe you have something where you can, let me throw something out here. Give them gifts. What's going to come out of the Industrial Revolution? It's mostly secular, the secular holiday of Christmas. Christmas before the Industrial Revolution was, I already told you, basically a drunken brawl. The important holiday for Christians is what? Easter. And most people, the citizens of the United States, were Christians, Protestant, mostly Protestant. The number of Catholics was growing in this era. Easter's the important holiday. In fact, that's why we have an accurate holidays, or accurate calendar, so they can find out when Easter is. They didn't know when Easter was, and they were on a lunar calendar, which is only a 28-day months. And so it messes up the calendar, and that's why they had to come up with the calendar we have now, in the 16th century. So you can figure out where Easter was. That's really no reason. But beginning in the 19th century, Christmas became a different holiday. It went from drunken we made it through the longest day of winter. Yay, we're alive. To something different. A way to be nice to children. It's no coincidence that literally out of the blue at the end of the 1850s, this guy appeared. And you notice I said secular outside the bounds of religion because Christmas is very much still a holiday for people who are not Christians. So my brother had to go to China all the time. Very small population of Christians, but he was in China a lot for work. And he hasn't gone since COVID. And he might not go back. 14-hour plane flights are kind of tough. You agree with me on that? And he said that, at Christmas time, there's Santa Clauses everywhere in China. And they're not Christian. So it's very much a secular holiday. There's also religious elements, of course, but this is why it became popular. Why? To give nice things to children. And Thomas Nast started making the Santa Claus that we know today. There was a St. Nick, and there was something called Santa Claus. In fact, most of them were very thin, kind of scary-looking guys from the Netherlands, but they turned into the jolly, fat guy in red. And the whole story about Santa Claus was made up. In fact, The Night Before Christmas, made up out of whole cloth. And A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, he just made it up. Just made up this whole thing about Christmas, and it just kind of stuck. People think that's the traditional Christmas. No, he just had a very active imagination. Opium may be involved, but I don't know. That's another story. But nothing wrong, good or bad about that. But that's how Christmas became a holiday. But how does it tie in with the Industrial Revolution? Not just in changes of families, but what other thing? So we have the ability to make it, but more importantly, they expand the market by having a day where people go buy goods. Doesn't Christmas increase the demand? What's the biggest day for stores? Yeah, the run up to Christmas. That's why. Heck, there are Christmas decorations up now in stores.
They cannot only do Halloween.
I heard about that. I didn't notice, but I know.
Costco starts at the end of August.
I'm not surprised. This is big money. And that's why I always laugh about when people say we should go back to the old-fashioned Christmas. And it's like, wait a second. First off, the old-fashioned Christmas you don't want. And secondly, Christmas is complex like everything. And one more thing I'll show you. This is something I've heard. It's started being used a lot, but have you ever seen this for Christmas? Anybody know what that means? It just means Christmas. This is Greek letter Christos. It's just Christmas. It's Chris, that's how you pronounce it. That's just Christmas. That's just another way, that's combining English and Greek. That's all it is. It just means Christmas. The X is just Chris in Greek. That's pronounced Chris in Greek. So if you ever see that, and I've heard people say it, I've heard so many different things what that is. No, it's just Christmas. And yes, the first full-time police force in New York City was to stop the old Christmas. Also, you can't wear masks in groups in New York City. That's another one. They have fun laws in New York City. So, what a big shift. All of a sudden, we care for our children. I'm going to add then, it's going to become then a massive issue with the Industrial Revolution, something called family planning. How to decide when and how you're going to have children. Because this becomes a massive issue with the finances for the family. It's hard to raise children if you don't have stable finances. This is going to snowball to, let's see, if we solve that today. No, not as of this time. We will get to that. A massive issue about this coming. Oh, here's Thomas Nast. It's no coincidence. Here's Santa giving soldiers of the Union soldiers during the Civil War gifts. By 1860, it's there. That's 1863. Thomas Nast cartoon. So, ironically, out of all of this, or maybe not ironically, the development of the women's rights movement. And these are middle-class women, the first women to really be pushed this cult of domesticity. And if women are responsible for the morality of the family, more and more you'll see women say, well, that's not enough for me. And if I can't go out into this world that men inhabit of business and finance, whatever it might be, a job, I'm going to get involved in society. I will help the morals and values of society. I almost forgot one thing. With the new Industrial Revolution, the first women's magazines would come out. They would be shockingly popular, pushing the cult of domesticity. They'd all be edited by men, but they also, ironically, had a lot of women writers, which kind of goes against the cult of domesticity. It's an interesting world. But they got involved in things outside. So, what's the abolitionist movement? Anti-what? What's abolitionist? That's anti-slavery. And by the way, if you did not know that, make sure you jot that down. Make sure you know that's anti-slavery. We'll talk more about it. Temperance is to try to at least curtail what? Drinking, which I already showed that first slide. But there's also a prison reform movement. Prisons were hellholes that judges could arbitrarily decide to send people or not send people. There was a whole reform movement to try to reform prisons, to make them more civilized, to give sentences for years in prison. By the way, these prisons were horrific too, but there's a reform movements to do something about, they literally called them then insane asylums, so people with mental illness, and they basically just chain up in rooms until they died. And they tried to change that with mixed results. But here's the thing. These middle-class women, wasn't enough for them. They want to get involved in society. Well, then they started looking at, okay, we're here trying to improve the rights of people. And I think you can probably guess where this is going to go. Wait a second, rights? What about our rights? What about the rights of women? Which make up, at that time, slightly less than half the population. Women make up significantly more than half the population now. Why? More women survive childbirth. Childbirth, which is a scourge for women, is so difficult. Any complications, there's nothing they could do in 1840. A third of all women died in childbirth. That doesn't happen now as much, so that's a huge change in lives. So, they're going to demand the basic equalities of being to live in a beautiful mountain valley. Equal legal, economic, and political rights. And the thing about it is that they're all interrelated, all of them. Economic rights, so that means your only economic value cannot be to provide a home for the husband who does all the work. Legal rights, for example, if you're married, you have a right to your own property and land and
lot of other stuff. But what's the most important? It's political. Because politics decide the rules of the economy. Politics decide the laws. It's all politics. Once again, if anybody tries to tell you that politics is important, it doesn't change, doesn't will affect your life, they're lying to you. They're scamming you. They want you to not be involved because they clearly have an advantage to the way things are. But I will agree with you that most people think politics is just electing people to office, which I find, as important as it is, tedious and boring. The important part is actually coming up with the laws and the fact how people can relate, which they don't cover very well. And so what do they want? The most important thing? I think you might guess what it might be. Vote. They want the right to vote, so they can influence politicians. Suffrage is a term for voting, so they added this E-T-T-E, suffragette, which is something from England. This actually the term came from. And so that's a way to say, well, this is for women's right to vote. So X would be added for women's things. But that was also kind of part of the cult of domesticity as a way to diminish it. Even though women a lot of times say, okay, I'll accept it. But to fight for the right to vote. Once you get the right to vote and pick politicians that will do things like improve legal rights or economic rights, that will be real power. And so, yes.
So I remember reading, it was about this, and it was a group that like wanted women to remain in the place that they were.
Yeah. There were a couple different groups in there.
Because for some reason I thought it was to speak about Baptism opposing.
That's opposed to suffragettes. That's it, yeah. But yeah, the idea called the domesticity says, no, women shouldn't vote.
Yeah, okay.
Women should be at home. Don't you like your life at home? Yeah, it's a good question actually, because they would be saying, no, the cult of domesticity is like is basically like it's handcuffed. It's saying that we can't do anything other than this one thing. Yeah.
Is it an idea or is it an actual group?
There were a few groups that were created to do something about this, but for the most part, this is kind of an idea being pushed around society too. They're telling everybody, this is not the way it was. Within 30 years, it became, oh yeah, we're all supposed to be this way. And so some of the most important women leaders, Lucretia Mott, all middle class, so they had a little bit of wealth, husbands worked. She was absolutely brilliant. A little bit, she was not quite as charismatic, and for a leader of a group, you really have to kind of pull people in. And that's what Susan B. or Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Also a brilliant person, very charismatic to bring people into this movement. Mott was an incredible organizer and get things together. Yeah, it's one thing about groups, you kind of need both elements. You need that charismatic group and someone to do that work, as with Mott. Both, Stanton could do both. And then somebody who idolized Mott, Susan B. Anthony. And she'd come a little bit later, and she, for the next 60 years, would fight tirelessly for the right to vote. And that's why the 19th Amendment is sometimes called, and should be called, the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. But that wouldn't come until 1920. And she would run for president in 1872. When after the Civil War, a lot of women said, okay, now if you're going to give former male slaves the right to vote, why not everybody? But that's not the way the law was written. It said men could not have their right to vote taken away. And so she would run for president and be arrested for that, or try to show how unequal that was. So she's obviously incredibly brave. There's going to be all kinds of fights that will do things about race and what to do about former slaves and women, and she'll be in the middle of that fight. So, in 1848, the first ever women's rights convention would take place in Seneca Falls, New York. And this is part of the burnt over district, which I'll get to in just a second. And remember the Declaration of Independence said, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. They added two words. Two words, all men and women. And that comes from the Declaration of Independence. So very radical stuff. Now, I don't want to diminish from the Declaration of Independence because all men being created equal, just men, that was seen as very radical. So what is radical and what means change and what some would argue is progress? I'm biased, I would argue. It can change over time, but a pretty radical statement. But the big element of this was we must fight for that political right to vote. Now, of course, that would turn out to probably not be enough, but it's going to be a 72-year fight. And we'll come back to this. A 72-year fight until the 19th Amendment. Now, states could have women vote before that. Montana was a very progressive state back in the early 20th century. And they, in 1914, allowed women to vote. Wyoming Territory had women vote in 1869. Utah, when it became this in 1890, would allow women to vote. You notice it's a Western thing. Why in the West? Women have more power. Think about in the West. Well, there's not going to be a factory job, and everybody has to, you have to be self-sufficient, and everybody's important. Also, like in Wyoming, the thought was the men coming in would be Democrats, and so they thought the women would be more apt to be Republicans. That's 18. This is just when Andrew Johnson was impeached, that kind of thing. So with that, even though the women's rights movement began, what country did the women's rights movement begin in? Didn't begin here. Who? France. Where is it? France? Where? Britain. Why Britain? That's where the Industrial Revolution began. The U.S. had the first women's rights convention. So we're first. This is actually the year of revolutions all over this beautiful skyscape. By the way, this morning or night? The red sky in the morning? Uh-oh, storm's coming. Sailor, take warning. And so here is mocking women, with saying, oh, if you allow women into the court system, this is supposed to be, they'll do all these women's things, like debate, sew, and men won't get anything done. And this will be a fight for a very long time. You can't let women do it because this is how women will act. And you hear this all the time, which is still kind of here. Also, another big change. You want to talk about a big change. The families are different. It's no coincidence that religion would be different. Capitalism led to a severe change in people's lives. They were scared. It was a scary thing. The life they thought they have is going to be different. It might be better, it might be worse, but difference is scary. Change leads to insecurity. Every single time where there's a time of great insecurity and change, this will lead to a time of religious upheaval too. And it's kind of happening now. And so you see it all the time. And so, first off, a different kind of churches, and don't take the name more liberal, think of the term as less of a dogma, that things you must do to be in the church. And these liberal churches, they basically accepted capitalism. Okay, in the new world, we accept it. This world is going to be dangerous. We'll try to help people. They mostly started up here. They came out of the Puritans. And their idea was, okay, this is a dangerous, scary world, but there is a loving God, and we can all get salvation. The thought was a very comforting message. By the way, Unitarian churches always had very high towers. It's a very much a New England thing. And so I always like those with the high towers. These are congregational churches today. They're the Unitarians or the Universalists. And Unitarian Universalist idea that universal salvation. Also, those who believe in the philosophy of deism, remember that's the God as a creator, they would come about. And once again, the term liberal and conservatives are used in so many different ways, it's really hard to tie them down. It's almost to the point where maybe we shouldn't use them anymore. I love the architecture behind older churches, regardless of religion. I just love it. But what really hit was this so-called Second Great Awakening. Just as the First Great Awakening 100 years earlier, a time of kind of moral and physical upheaval, the change in society, wars in the 1740s, here the Industrial Revolution. Wage system was so disruptive and scary. I mean, this concept where, okay, it's tough, backbreaking work, relied upon weather or a whole number of things, but you survive by your own hands. Now, if you can't get a job because companies aren't hiring, you starve. And these machines taking workers' jobs, there's going to be all these pictures at this time of like machines controlling people like they're puppets, which is kind of interesting, isn't it? Because we see those kind of things all the way through today. There's going to be fear of the machines and artificial intelligence, and there's a big fear that there'll be no more truckers anymore, and they lose other jobs because of self-driving cars, which aren't going to happen for a very long time. But they always say they're going to because of these great fears of this disruption. I will probably be gone when they're on the wide scale. But this is going to lead to this idea of going back to the way things work. And this would have been dubbed conservative at that time. And it fits a little bit with it today. And we all have this kind of attitude, boy, weren't things better before? But the idea of conservative comes from the reaction to the French Revolution. That's where that term comes from. Once again, words are used all over. But it wasn't to go back to exactly the way things were, because there are a lot of problems the way things were. It's more like, go back to the way things should have been. Life was a lot better back then, as long as we ignore the bad parts. Which, yeah, I guess we can say that about anything. So that's why you see this at a time like, let's go back to 1800. 1800 was really hard. You'll see that in the 1890s. Terrible economic change. Boy, wasn't life great in the 1870s? Actually, no. My personal favorite was in the 1920s. It was to go back to the gay 90s. That's what they called the 1890s. And the 1890s was a time of economic depression. In the 1970s, I can vividly remember this big wave of nostalgia for the 1950s. The most popular television show in America back when television was so much more dominant was a show called Happy Days about the 1950s and all these movies about it. And the songs were kind of go back to that 50s style rock and roll. Yeah, there's some good things about the 50s, also really bad things. Today, what do people look back to? I see a little bit early 2000s or the 1990s. I remember back in the early 2000s, just go back to the 1980s. I was like, no, don't. But anyways, always kind of this look back to the way when things were better. And one important element there wasn't all this change. And you hear a lot of when people just live with us. There's all this complaining and whining. No, there's actually always complaining, or people sometimes, I think a lot of times, justifiably whining about their position. But there's this wave of nostalgia. The way it was. And this concept will be used a lot. Like, especially by people saying we've become too decadent. Let's go back to when people were moral. Benito Mussolini used that. And so, two of the big religions come out. They're very new religions out of what country? Britain. The Baptists and the Methodists. They're very open to encouraging more people into their faith. They had these fire and brimstone sermons where people would go into this kind of religious convulsions and speak in tongues. They must have been just remarkable things. And yes, they still happen. You don't see them as much in places like Montana, but this is still very much a phenomenon. Must be in the southern latitudes. And the Baptist church would split over slavery, by the way, Northern and Southern Baptists. But it was these new religions. And they would have these evangelical revivals. Evangelical is this effort to actively encourage people to join. And these were considered churches way out of the mainstream. Even though it's kind of weird to think about like Methodists being out of the mainstream today, but it was then. And this whole idea is we can provide you security. The world is scary, come into here. We'll be safe. We're all together. And unlike Catholicism, which is very much based upon dogma and saying certain things back then, all in Latin, and doing certain things to prove that you're a member of church and you'll receive salvation. Or the Puritan faith, read carefully through the Bible, know exactly whether or not you're blessed and going to heaven or not. Very organized, very Bible-centric. This is more, these evangelical faiths were based more upon a very charismatic preacher. In fact, they called them charismatics. And it was very emotional. They would get people up in this almost fervor. In fact, this is where the term fire and brimstone sermons came from. This was actually a huge way to get in the 1920s, like just this dramatic way. And this is where you start getting terms of those who have accepted this new, joined this sect of Christianity. This is where the term born again would come from. And in the 20th century, this would be adopted to the rapture. That's a 20th century phenomenon. And have you ever heard the term fundamentalism? It didn't come here. That's going to come in the teens of the 20th century. 1910, in fact, the term would first be used. But it's a progression of this that starts with the Second Great Awakening. But here's the important thing. The Industrial Revolution changed religion. And this is kind of a big deal. You see why I'm emphasizing this a lot? This really changes everything. And by the way, anybody know what millennialism is? Okay, this fits in with this. That someday, for Christians, there will be a reckoning. And our world will end. Usually the concept that either Jesus or God, it depends on the faith, would come back. Those who have been, in this concept, saved or born again will go up to heaven. That's where that term comes from. Now, this millennialism is either, it's going to happen and it's just going to be now. And those who are left will have a fiery hell. Or it will come later and we must prepare for it. It's two different points of view. But there's going to be a couple sects that will, I jumped the gun. And so the big element of this is, the world is scary. Accept the material world. And this has an element of early Christianity, accept the Romans, they're horrible, and you might get salvation down the road. But this means accept capitalism. I know it's scary, but accept it. Then a better life and afterlife will be down the road. Who benefits from this? These traveling religious revivals cost a lot of money. Who would pay a lot of this money? Nothing's black and white. There's a lot of gray area. Who benefits from people saying, okay, I accept this. I accept the wage system. Some of the first merchant capitalists would fund this. Give them money. And the political party that would be a reaction against the democracy of Andrew Jackson, the Whigs, they would support this. The godless Democrats of Andrew Jackson. Yeah, this is it's amazing how everything blends together. I'm fascinated by it. By the way, it doesn't mean this is good or bad. Because I see elements of good and bad in almost everything. Except for people who don't like Kit Kats. I don't know, it's tough. There's not a gray area there. So New York would be famous for this. It's because of all the fire and brimstone speeches. You're going to have the burnt over district. And it makes sense upstate New York, because New York City is becoming the center of the new capitalist system. So you can see all these people kind of running away. It's also no coincidence, Seneca Falls right there. There's a resort there. And they had hot springs with sulfur, so it was kind of a healing. You get a little bit of the cure if you would go there. I've not been to Seneca Falls, but I guess it's really pretty cool, and what they have there is neat. So when we take our bus tour of America, we'll stop there. So you're going to get some fringe Protestant faiths that the mainstream ones are going to call them, using a very loaded word called cult. But some faiths like the Shakers, and the Shakers would go into this religious ecstasy where they would move and shake and quake. Their issue was there would be marriages of Shakers but there was supposed to be no intimate relations. So what happened to the Shakers? Eventually, there would be no more Shakers because they didn't have children. So the Shakers would die out. They were always relatively small. It was seen as kind of an insult. The Millerites believed in that millennialism. And in 1844, they came up with a date. Was it April 12th, 1844? That the world's going to end. And here's mocking them. Here's the Millerites going out on top of the roofs to wait to be taken up to heaven. With the expectation is the rest of the world will be engulfed in flame. They will be saved because they believe. Now this, I'm going to try, I don't know if you know this or not, but it didn't happen. They actually picked this, you might lose credibility, but actually they got more people when they said, oh, we did the date wrong. I'm like, oh, and more people came up on the roof 2 months later. The Millerites still are around, but not quite the same. And this shows you a little bit of how when people become zealots over anything, they literally call it the great disappointment when the world was not destroyed and millions of people didn't die. That's a little bit scary, isn't it? We're not more about the cult of Matthias. That was another cult. Now, some of these started out as relatively fringe and small are going to become very mainstream today. And so one is, and these become good, and they would go through all kinds of changes and iterations. The Millerites would eventually mold into the Seventh-day Adventists, and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which was started in the Burned-over district, would eventually form. And by the way, the term Mormon was meant to be an insult at first, but especially by the early 1900s, a lot of members of that church would adopt it and say, oh yeah, we'll take it. Just like citizens of the United States Yankees was meant to be an insult. And they would say, oh yeah, okay, we'll be the Yankees. And part of the reason that Mormons were able to survive as a faith is because the bell rang. No, they had to run away. We'll talk more about this when we get to the West. I'll tell you about them, the running away, which saved them. It's a really good story. You said my name.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Read chapter 10. And you got kind of know when Andrew Jackson. I will post, I don't have it done yet, but I'll post a review this where I'm going to have a small task here. So I'll get that in for as soon as I can. Just checking. Are you going to check these?
Yeah.
Okay. See you. Have a good day. Goodbye, everybody. Some do and some don't.
Yeah, because I've talked to certain people and they say I'm part of Latter-day Saints.
Oh, and I can understand because it really was started as an insult to a lot of them. And yeah, and I can understand that. You know, I think most people who refer to that people not being Mormons aren't trying to insult.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Okay.
I don't, and there's people I've had in class around that. And I certainly understand. You gotta have a good weekend. Get it. Yeah, I'm right behind you. We're working. I gotta get back learning Spanish.
That guy took the sleep. He was so
Broken.
horrible, and I hated it.
Dude, but like the whole
Dude!
last week you weren't wearing a Hawaiian shirt.
Dude!
You were wearing a cat shirt.
Am I wearing cowboy boots and chaps? That's what a dude is.
Okay, I'm going to bed. Wait, but you were wearing a Hawaiian shirt last week.
Yeah, what's up?
Yeah, you were. I swear you were.
What are you talking about?
Yes.
I'm gonna wear a Hawaiian shirt.
Because every Friday you wear a Hawaiian shirt.
Obviously I don't.
Oh, last Friday you certainly didn't. It ruined the mojo.
What mojo?
I don't know, it's mojo of life. Can I find a water bottle really quick?
I'm tying my shoe, man.
Hey man,
We gotta be prepared for anything.
you're right.
Can I find my water bottle really quick?
I don't know, can you?
May I?
Go! Run like the wind. Oh, teamwork. Part of the KISS Army, huh? Fit me.
I don't really like.
Mr. Carter.
I'll try to spin it.
I mean, it's not. They're not. But they're not like. I don't know. I like the shirt more than I like the band.
KISS, yeah. They have about 3 songs.
Yeah, literally, and then the rest is like.
3, and any other song is just a different version of that.
Yeah.
It was more the makeup and what a big deal they were.
Like I said, it's shirt.
Yeah. Yeah, they were huge. I remember when they came to Billings in 1977 and they literally shut the town down. It was just crazy. All these kids came out and skipped school. They're all dressed up. Not me. There's other bands like, I think almost every band, not almost, but a lot of bands have like 3 songs. AC/DC has 3 songs. Every song they have is a version of the same song.
No.
Now, I would argue AC/DC has 3 much better songs than KISS.
Yes.
I think they're very good songs. It's all basically the same rhythm. The Rolling Stones have about 6. They're really good. Don't glare at me.
I don't buy that. I was a glare.
Name 4 songs.
I like Fucking Thunderstruck.
Thunderstruck is like, there's like 7 songs AC/DC does that are like Thunderstruck.
Yes,
Are they not start the same? The thunder? It's like thunder.
I actually, even though they're way too Australian, I like AC/DC too.
No, she actually, she's.
I just like singing.
No, I love you like CD. You like Intercom, that's all I ever played.
Huh? You have a CD?
Yeah, yeah.
So you like Australian music?
Oh, no,
In my
it's
presence, Australian? How dare you? Scooby-Doo is not amused.
I actually like, it's my stuff.
Does anyone in here like Australian music?